I'll ask to call the meeting to order of January 15th, 2008 of the Ordinance Committee, first meeting of the year. Item 1 is election of the chair.
Okay, well, anyway, you're not the chair yet, but it's nice of you to introduce the meeting today. As the first order of business, I move that we select Das Williams as the chair of the Ordinance Committee for this year.
Thank you so much, Grant.
Is there a second?
Second.
I stand in opposition to my, no.
Any discussion on the motion?
Any discussion on the motion? No? Hearing none? Ayes? Aye?
Aye.
Aye. Aye? Noes?
Okay,
Thank you.
Congratulations on becoming the chair of our great committee.
All right. Item 2.
Yes, thank you, Chair Williams. I'd like to first make an announcement regarding our location today and other activities around the building here at 630 Garden Street. We are in the process of moving, and there are people with large furniture and boxes moving up and down the hallways around this meeting room, and they were requested to be aware of this meeting, but they are going to be continuing. If at any point we feel that it's too much of an interruption, either myself or one of the staff will go out and contact the people involved and ask them to redirect their efforts outside of this immediate area. Right now it's quiet, but I can tell you at different points there is quite a bit of noise generated, so we'll just have to stay tuned regarding that. Okay, I'd like to provide a few introductory comments today regarding the zoning ordinance amendment package that the Community Development Department we've been working on for some time. The focus of today's meeting is a number of subjects which are outlined in your council agenda report for today, and Ms. Susie Reardon, Senior Planner, will be going through the package of materials with you in a workshop format that we used last time we met with the Ordinance Committee here in the Gebhardt Room, and I'll touch on that a bit more in just a minute. But first I wanted to provide for the committee an overall summary of what the zoning ordinance amendment package is about. And today's items are only a portion of the overall effort that we're undertaking to look at the zoning ordinance. In 2005, the Planning Division held one of its regular workload check-in meetings, a joint meeting of the Planning Commission and City Council, where we laid out a goal to look at a number of sections of the zoning ordinance as a major workload item for the Planning Division. And we would be taking different sections to the Planning Commission and Ordinance Committee to look to clarify existing ordinance language, and primarily in the ease of implementation of the ordinance. There was an opportunity in 2005 to make a staff reassignment to make some progress on the zoning ordinance. This effort is something that we would like to have as a regular part of our work, but quite frankly, priorities shift quite a bit, and we're actually coming to the end of the opportunity to have work done by this particular team on this ordinance package. But all the same, we're making as best progress as we can. So what we did is we presented at Planning Commission hearings a series of sections of the zoning ordinance to clarify and improve the implementation, as well as deal with modifications. I wanted to mention and explain how this zoning ordinance package relates to modifications. Within the Planning Division's P3 performance measures, we have identified that we analyzed what type of modifications are more routinely issued and approved. And if there are some that basically a new standard of the zoning ordinance, a reasonable standard that you look at this and say, this is how we define front yards or open yards on corner lots, and we're prepared to define it this way time and time again, then it would be a standard, rather than what we've been finding now, that there are sections in the zoning ordinance that really are modified enough that it should be a standard. In other words, they're good modifications. They're not particularly tricky ones where a lot of case-by-case review is necessary. So throughout these packages of zoning amendments, there are one or two items from time to time that relate back to modification requests. And today I think we'll be talking about a few of those. This overall zoning ordinance amendment objective is not to introduce major new policy or be getting ahead, say, of the planned Santa Barbara process. There are some policy decisions, however, involved in working through these amendments, but they're policy decisions in a pretty much now focus within the context of existing city policy, the fact that the zoning ordinance applies day in, day out to properties everywhere throughout the city, and there is a need to apply the zoning ordinance on a daily, hourly, minute basis, and there is a need to improve and clarify it. So there were one or two issues, one in particular, that came up as being a bigger concern. For example, last time we were at the Ordinance Committee, there was the question of how would the 10% open space standard for mixed-use projects be applied. For several years now, staff and the Planning Commission have looked at modifications of the 10% open space standard. There was concern on the part of the Planning Commission recently, members of the community, that really looking at the standards related to open space and mixed use would not be appropriate at this time. So that's been taken off the table. Again, if in the course of deliberating on any of these issues, the Ordinance Committee feels that they have a broader or longer term implication, then those can be put aside. We want to stay with the intent, which is just to make the regular working of the zoning ordinance better for all involved. And on that point, I wanted to note that throughout the process to date, we have had quite a bit of dialogue in the community. The staff has gone to the Citizens Planning Association, Land Use Committee. We've held discussions, extensive discussions with applicants and architects. We've been working closely with the Planning Commission. We had a number of Planning Commission hearings. The last meeting here, 2 members of the Planning Commission did attend an Ordinance Committee meeting. So there has been quite a bit of work going into this. Now here's the more direct history with the Ordinance Committee. After the Planning Commission reviews and a fair amount of staff work, we went to an Ordinance Committee meeting at the Council Chambers, and we presented the entirety of the set of zoning amendments that we're looking at. And the Council, the Committee, and the members of the public were a bit overwhelmed. They said, there is a lot of information here. Let's break this into smaller pieces and have meetings at the Gephardt Room where it can be a little more informal. Members of the public can have ready access to the microphone. We'll break the discussion into smaller bits and have more of semi-workshop environment. So the Ordinance Committee had that overall meeting where there was some discussion, direction to us to come to Gephardt Room. So we did have a meeting in the Gephardt Room, and we went over a series of amendments. Today we won't really be reviewing that with you all. I realize that only committee member House has had the opportunity to see that earlier package. The other members of the committee, what I'd like to explain is we had one meeting here, then we have today, and then there'd be a third meeting, again, breaking this into 3 pieces at the David Gephardt Room, this kind of format. Then we'll work with the city attorney and prepare the entirety of the ordinance to come back to the full Ordinance Committee. So hopefully this committee, you will have seen, all 3 of you, 2 out of the 3 parts here in a Gephardt setting, and the whole. And we will work with the chair and the new member, council member Francisco, to bring you up to speed on that one piece that you missed, the one prior work session. But that really won't matter for today. You can roll up your sleeves and get into today's package, and know that we have scheduled for February to come back. Mr. Reardon will wrap up with that too. One more session like this, and then working with the city attorney on the complete actual ordinance itself. So if you have any questions for me on that overview, now would be a good time, but Ms. Reardon is ready to go on today's meeting.
Council member questions? Mr. Francis?
Yes, I have a question. How will we handle public comment in this?
Okay. The way that we've done it before is the chair of the committee last time, every time that the committee took a break to ask if there were any questions, we would ask members of the public whether or not they had questions. But my understanding is we basically would go through the whole presentation and then hold a public comment period. But again, if members of the audience had a question at a later date, this was a little more flexible where the chair acknowledges that person and they could come up and ask. So it's a little bit different than your classic hearing where we're encouraging people to break in at different points. Mm-hmm. But still, the intent is to hold one hearing where we gather the slips after the presentation and hear from everyone. If that makes sense.
Okay.
Thanks.
Any other council member questions? With that, then, I do want to say that please restrain yourself from making any advocacy comments and save that for till after the presentation. But if there are questions, we know this packet is a bit arcane. So if anybody from the audience has questions, please come up to the mic. No questions? Then Mr. Kaida. Oh, Mrs. Reardon.
Thank you, Chair Williams, members of the Ordinance Committee. The topics we'll discuss today are listed on the slide, with the exception of non-conforming open yard area. We deal with properties with non-conforming open yards quite often, and that issue is a very important issue. And while we were preparing for today's meeting, it became evident that we really need to have more staff level discussion to fully flesh out the issues and the ramifications of any recommendations before we bring it to the committee. So we would like to postpone discussion on that topic. Okay, in my presentation, I planned on just discussing the first 4 options, but all of these topics are going to be covered and up for discussion by the committee. The first one's in regards to yard encroachments, and currently the municipal code allows a number of types of structures to encroach into a required yard. And a required yard, it could be a setback, it could be an open yard area, it could be common outdoor living area. That's one of the problems with the zoning ordinance, is that it has this generic yard, and so we want to go through the zoning ordinance and specify what it means. If it means a setback, we're going to change a setback. So the first encroachment that's currently allowed is an unenclosed structure may occupy up to 20% of the required open yard. And in the single family and R2 zones, those properties are required to have 1,250 square feet of open yard area. So therefore, up to 20% or 250 square feet can be occupied by like a gazebo or patio cover or play equipment, and that's currently allowed right now. Another encroachment that's allowed is an uncovered balcony, cornice, canopy, chimney, or other similar features. Those can extend up to 2 feet into a required yard. However, with the recent neighborhood preservation ordinance updates, that provision for balconies to encroach into the required yard is not available in the single-family zones. Also, first floor porches, terraces, and outside stairways, they can project up to 3 feet into a required interior setback. And then rooftop solar energy systems may extend up to 2 feet into a required yard. And we're proposing to clarify these provisions and then also codify how staff has been handling them, as well as add a couple new provisions, and I'll cover those in my presentation. The first clarification is that we're proposing to clarify that existing standard, that it also pertains to unenclosed structures that are attached to the wall of a main building, that those may also encroach into the open yard up to 20%. And then also, if the open yard area is provided in more than one area, then that 20% encroachment applies to each individual area. And in the R2 zone, that 1,250 square foot area could be provided in one or more areas, as long as each area is a minimum of 400 square feet. And it's not the intent of the zoning ordinance to have 250 square feet of that area to be covered. So we want to specify that each individual area is limited to that 20% maximum. And then we also want to make it clear that roof eaves cannot be located closer than 2 feet from a property line. And this illustration illustrates that. This awning here, it's limited to 20% of the open area up to the top, as well as this patio cover. And both of these cannot exceed 250 square feet. And then garages in the R2 zone, they're allowed currently to be located 3 feet from the interior property line. And the building code specifies that eaves cannot be located closer than 2 feet. So we want to make that clear that the eave needs to be at least 2 feet over. In regards to codification of existing administrative policy, we want to specify that decks that are less than 10 inches in height above grade are allowed in a required setback. That if the existing open yard area is less than 1,250 square feet, that is, it's non-conforming to size, then that 20% encroachment is limited to the actual size of that open yard area. And then we also want to allow uncovered parking, planters less than 10 inches in height from grade, paving and fences, hedges, and walls to encroach into the minimum distance between buildings. And this illustration shows some of that. Here's a deck that's less than 10 inches in height above grade, and it can encroach into an interior yard setback as well as an open yard area. And then this open yard area back here, it's non-conforming. It's less than the 1,250 square feet. So this proposed gazebo is limited to 20% of that area. We also want to allow or codify our policy to allow balconies, decks, porches, and terraces that do not provide additional floor area. The policy to allow trash and water heater enclosures or water softeners and unenclosed exterior stairways to allow those to encroach a maximum of 3 feet into the required minimum distance between buildings. And this graphic illustrates that there's a 10-foot minimum distance between buildings, and then a balcony is shown, 3 feet, and the trash is 3 feet, so it'd be 9 feet between there. Yeah.
What does it mean about not providing floor area?
Not providing floor area, so it can't be enclosed. So if it's, it needs to be open above and below.
So people can walk on it, but it's...
You can't use it. Yeah, we want it to be non-habitable. Okay, and then the last one. Can I interject? Floor area is often
defined as consisting of 4 walls and a roof. So an area that is a covered balcony is not necessarily floor area, because those that may have railings but not conditioned walls. But that question of whether or not something constitutes floor area and this particular set of standards that we're trying to codify, I can tell you that many architects have this big time back and forth with us. Is a window seat floor area? If it just juts above and it's not where your feet are standing, but it's all enclosed and it's part of the roof, is that floor area or not? So you definitely hit on a major sticking point on how to determine what's supplying
the
area.
rooftop jacuzzi floor area.
No.
Since we had a question from a council member, we'll also entertain questions from the public. Ms. Reyes?
Microphone?
Please go to the mic.
One of the concerns that I have when I see the diagrams is that I see the development in one house or one structure, but I would like to see the diagram of what the next door, if they wanted the same privileges, could do. And my concern is this: has this been run by the fire department? We have a serious problem of fire potential in the city of Santa Barbara. And the closer we build structures and the more that we put into the side yard setbacks, et cetera, it increases the potential of fire to be passed from structure to structure. So I would like the group to see what happens with if each lot is built up to this maximum, and the potential for fire and safety and the ability of the fire truck to have access to the structures.
The first one, I'll request just that when we do any future drawings, that maybe we do try to illustrate the cumulative effect. That would be for the next workshop. And can staff answer the question about coordination with the fire department?
We have discussed with the fire department and the building department. That's one of the reasons, like the example of the roof eaves, that is a building code requirement that they can't be located at 2 feet. There's the building code requirement also about 5 feet separation between the buildings, and if they're closer, they need to have 1 hour fire protection. So all our amendments are consistent with the building and fire code. In regards to fire access, it's my understanding the fire department doesn't actually like to drive on properties. They rather park in the street and carry their hose back. That's why we have limitations on the length of the driveway and the width and that kind of thing. So what we're proposing, I feel, is consistent with both those codes.
My two questions thus far also have to do with maybe other unintended consequences. Why would the zoning ordinance have less tolerance for solar energy system than it does for porches, terraces, and outside stairways? In terms of you're suggesting that those other structures have a, I thought, 3 feet ability to move 3 feet into the interior yard, but a solar energy system would only be allowed 2 feet. And given that it's contrary to state law to unduly interfere with the placement of solar systems, why would we make the zoning ordinance more restrictive on solar systems?
Chair Williams, I think I can answer that. So, first of all, I think you're probably getting a little bit confused because it is confusing, the 3 feet, the 2 feet, what can encroach into what. Basically, eaves can encroach into setbacks 2 feet. So solar panels only, for roof-mounted solar systems, we said they can also encroach all the way down to the level of the eave. That's where the 2 feet comes from, and that was done previously. The 3 feet, there's two things that are going on. First of all, distance between buildings on the same lot, and we're saying balconies and such can encroach 3 feet into a distance between buildings, like the illustration up there. That has nothing to do with the setbacks. Solar panels could be on those balconies and trash enclosures also. I mean, that's all on the same property. The other thing where the 3 foot comes in is an uncovered porch currently is allowed to encroach into an interior setback 3 feet. Like if you have a raised foundation building and you have a little side door, you get a little 3 foot encroachment so you can have a little patio. So that's all. That, as currently written, is not supposed to encroach. It's not supposed to be higher than the level of the first floor. So it's kind of 3 different things. As far as what's allowed to encroach from the roof, it's 2 feet from the eaves, and the solar panels the same as that. Everything else is sort of a different animal.
So the principle is in the air, 2 feet, on the ground, 3 feet.
Correct. And the whole point with the solar panels is they should be allowed to encroach the same amount as any eave is allowed to encroach.
Okay. And then the other question is, what would be the public good of including water softeners in the allowable uses in there, or are they already in the allowable uses, given that our water department doesn't want us to promote water softeners?
Chair Williams, we actually didn't consider what the water department wanted as far as water softeners. These are the types of items that we see, on a weekly basis. People wanting to go into their distance between buildings, water heaters, just these things like that. So it's just kind of on a list of various things that we've heard in the past.
Okay. And just so that we can also move through this, let's try to let staff get to the end of each subsection before we ask questions.
Thank you, Chair Williams.
I'll chastise myself right after asking.
Okay, the final item that we want to codify our administrative policies relates to detached accessory structures, and to allow them to encroach into the required minimum distance between buildings as long as they're located at least 5 feet from the main building. And again, I have there we go. My drawing, which illustrates that there's a required 15, in this example, the minimum distance between the buildings required to be 15 feet. Therefore, a shed could be located in between as long as there's 5 foot between the main building. In regards to the new provisions, we're proposing to allow bay windows which are at least 3 feet above grade or the finished floor to encroach up to 2 feet into the front setback. And the reason why we want it to be 3 feet above existing grade or the finished floor is so that it's truly an architectural feature and that it's not habitable space that's being provided in the setback. That's something that needs to continue to require modification if it's habitable space. We also want to add a provision to allow uncovered second-story decks above patio covers to encroach a maximum of 20% into the required open yard. And currently, as I said earlier, patio covers can encroach into the required open yard area. The change is that we would allow the cover of that patio cover to be used as a second-story deck. And then we also want to allow a small entrance landing, either covered or uncovered, to encroach into the front setback, a total of 3 feet. And here's an illustration of it. It could be a bay window up front that can go 2 feet, maybe a landing 3 feet. And in your back, you have a second-story deck above a patio cover. And when I talk about entrance landings or steps, it's something similar to this. It's a way to get to your elevated front door. And in this instance, 3 feet would probably only encompass the front steps, so the rest would have to be outside of the front yard setback. Here's an example of a covered landing in entrance steps. And again, the first 3 feet, basically the steps we're proposing to allow those in the front setback without a mod. This example here is actually a little more than what we're proposing. It has a porch element off to the side. So if it was to end right past the door, so there'd be steps and then a little covered entry area, this would be consistent with what we're thinking. We just believe porch elements should be located out of the front setback. They are a valuable amenity to the property, but it's something that should conform to the setback, because it may encompass the whole front of the building, and that's just too much. The next section is in regards to renting of rooms in single-family zones. And from time to time, we receive complaints regarding the renting of rooms in single-family zones. And these complaints focus mainly on the transient use of the house, excessive people, cars, and noise, cars parked in the front yard, illegal garage and room conversions. And the city has limited ability to regulate the renting of rooms in single-family zones due to
Let's just ask briefly, since we're at the end of a section, if there's any questions on yard encroachments from council members first. Mr. House?
There's one thing that you almost touched on, but it's not in our packet today, and I wonder when we would be discussing it, and it has to do with whether porches can be considered part of the required open yard. As now, open yard would be dirt with maybe I guess it could have a patio cover over a portion of it, I think. But can a porch, which has a place for a rocking chair and an actual viable porch, be considered? When will we be discussing that? I'd be interested in knowing that.
Clarification question. Are you referring to front yard porch?
First of all, I'm not talking about encroachments into any setbacks. I'm only talking about its effect on the open yard requirement, the 1,250 square feet requirement. And the question that I'm having has to do with whether a viable porch, not just an architectural feature, but a viable porch where people could go and sit on and actually enjoy being outdoors. Maybe it has a cover over it. Whether and where we would discuss if that could be part of the open yard.
I think that's part of what we're talking about today. Would that be an allowed 20% item?
Not if it's in the front yard. Back in October, when we had a discussion on this, we were proposing to allow a portion of a secondary front yard to count towards the required open yard area. What we're talking about today regarding the patio covers and using those as decks, those can encroach into the 20% or into the required open yard area up to 20%. So that would be allowed. But since porches are generally in front of the house and over, looking the street and usable areas, that currently is not allowed to count as part of your open yard area.
I'm not sure where I come down on it, whether I'm for it or against it, but the idea that we want to encourage viable porches on homes, and they are really an important amenity for a neighborhood, and yet I think up to now they don't count towards open yard requirements. So there's almost a disincentive for a porch on a home. Yeah. And all we get are these little 2-foot, make-believe porches. So I'm just wondering if that's something we would be discussing today.
I have the same concern. I wrote down, do we have enough incentive for porches? That obviously in the history of the zoning ordinance for the past X amount of time does not seem to have much incentive for porches, given that nobody builds front yard porches very often anymore. So most of the porches we have are in the old bungalow neighborhoods. And I wonder if that's a unintended consequence of our zoning ordinance, or if there's a reason why we wanted that to happen.
I think this subject is before the committee today. Committee member House, his question was about, are porches allowed to count as something allowed in your open yard? Okay? What the committee needs to understand is that most frequently the open yard is what people think of as their backyard. The open yard only in certain circumstances can include part of your front yard. And that is even a new thing that we're talking about, that people that have corner lots, one of their street frontages could count towards their open yard, even though technically it is a front yard. I think the committee members are talking about the question that we have before you today on the screen is how much of a covered porch is an allowed encroachment into a required front yard setback. I know these terms, this is something we're really trying to clarify. I think the question that Committee Member House wanted to ask was how much front yard required setback encroachment is allowed for a porch?
Well, I was trying to avoid talking about going into the setbacks. My first question, which is sort of subset to that, I guess,
okay,
is if a porch were to not count as open yard, wherever it might be, then I wanted to have a discussion about that. We've talked about 20%,
yes,
okay, for these other kinds of things, the patio and the 3 foot above, all that. So we've got 20% we've been discussing. And I'm interested in including porches in that 20%.
There's no problem with that, I think.
I mean, it seems like we're heading in that direction, but I didn't see it explicitly indicated here.
Councilmember House, when we were here with you in October, that is one of the things we talked about. We would allow an open yard. We would allow decks up to 36 inches average height. So as long as the porch is less than 36 inches in height, it's already covered. And we've talked about that as far as encroachment into open yard, which is normally in the backyard. All right, so
now that's okay
like
with a cover like we're seeing here.
If this was in the backyard, this is a back porch,
sure,
and that was less than 3 feet in height, that would count.
Okay, excellent. So that's the one piece.
Covered.
Now there's this other one that you've helped articulate, which has to do with front yard setback, which is where we most often are talking about porches.
And that's where we are today.
Okay. So what is the state of affairs right now? How do we deal with a porch and a front yard setback?
Councilmember House, currently porches are not allowed in setbacks. So in order to have something like this, the front edge of the porch would have to be at the setback. And you could go, as long as that porch is outside the setback, it could go completely along the width of the house, as deep as you want, whatever, right? It could be as big a porch as you want as long as it's outside the setback. What we're finding is that people don't want to put these in because that's taking up usable floor area. They want to push their building to the front setback to maximize development, and then on top of that, they're asking for perhaps for a porch that would encroach partially or fully into the setback. And what we are proposing, what we've been talking about so far has been, we don't really want that in the setback. We think that's probably leading to overdevelopment, but we're thinking a little stoop port, a little thing that just provides access to your front door when you have a raised foundation would be an appropriate encroachment.
Okay. And I don't just for the committee, I don't think I'm ready to go to requesting us to allow for the porches in the required front yard setback. I recognize the importance of maintaining that. I think my main concern now, listening to our discussion here, has been with the way we deal with open yard, and I think we've already handled that.
And in this regard, I just wanted to point out, right now there's some allowance for these stairs to go into a raised level home on the side yard, but not in the front yard.
Right.
And believe it or not, let's say you have this raised home, your front steps are considered an encroachment. But around the back of your house or the side of your house coming out of your kitchen, the steps are allowed. So the change that this amendment would present is to allow front yard steps up to 3 feet, as well as a covered entry. And so we want to define the covered entry as that area around, immediately surrounding the doorway, and not, as you see in the photo above, extending further along the front of the house as an allowed encroachment into the front yard.
It's very clear to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Maybe Mr. Khan has something.
Mr. Khan, is this question on porches or on something else? Okay.
The reason I came up to the microphone is you asked Mrs. Arias to come up, but I thought I'd save some time. My concern is, and it's just pointing out something. Thank you. My name is Jim Kahn, and my concern with this is that I look around town, especially in the old Victorians, and I look at how many porches have been enclosed on the ground level and on the upper levels, and I say to myself, it's a way of getting something in, and it might be architecturally beautiful if you add it, but then there's such a desire for space, they enclose it. So I'm very reluctant to allow parts of structures in because they don't last, and we know that our enforcement level in the city is not such that we can correct them. Thank you.
I guess my question of staff on the subject would be, have you looked at any middle ground on this where you account a percentage of the encroachment and a percentage only of the encroachment in porches instead of a totality? Meaning I can understand that we do not want to allow further encroachment so as to incentivize building up right up against the line. But I also could see that this is a neighborhood amenity and that we should try to build some kind of incentive into the zoning ordinance to have them.
My comment on that is, to date, anyone proposing a front yard porch within the setback has been subject to a modification review.
Okay.
So what
That's
we've
true.
been finding in the modification review, either at the modification or staff hearing officer or planning commission, is really a case-by-case review. And in some neighborhoods, the street character of deep front yards or narrower front yards, it really depends. That's why I think we're proposing that front porches comply with the setbacks, or if someone wants to make a case for an encroachment, then they would request a modification.
Okay. Any other questions on yard encroachments from the audience? Okay, let's move on to renters.
Thank you, Chair Williams. Like I was saying, from time to time, the city receives complaints regarding the renting of rooms in single-family zones, and these complaints focus mainly on the transient use of the house, excessive people, noise in cars, when cars parked in the front yard or in other setbacks, and then illegal garage and room conversions. And the city has limited ability to enforce on the renting of rooms or to regulate the number of people living in single-family homes due to a California Supreme Court decision. More recently, the California Attorney General issued an opinion on how a local jurisdiction may limit commercial operations such as a boarding house in these single-family zones by regulating the number of leases that could be held in a house. And we've researched other jurisdictions that have adopted ordinances in line with the Attorney General's opinion, and also discussed with our attorney's office. And we don't recommend the Ordinance Committee pursuing an option in line with the Attorney General's opinion, because the enforcement efforts can be easily blocked by the coaching of tenants. And so we don't want to continue to create these unrealistic expectations of the neighbors that we can enforce on the number of people renting or living in a house. And so originally we were proposing just to delete the provisions. But in reviewing it, we were proposing to keep the conditional use requirements for properties zoned R2, R3, and R4 so that owners of those properties would have a legal avenue to pursue a boarding house. But we recommend tightening up the definition of boarding house to focus on form and function and not on occupancy. But in amending this definition, we still wouldn't use it to enforce on single-family homes, because when you have the situation when there's multiple tenants in the house and they share the house, they share the cooking, they share the living areas, that's not a boarding house. We would continue, we have mechanisms now to deal with those types of issues. We have, enforcement staff to deal with parking issues. We have the noise ordinance, and we have the building code and enforcement on illegal room and room conversions and construction. So we would continue to deal with those types of issues. Also, we're hoping in future zoning ordinance amendment phases that we would look at a property maintenance ordinance, and then also look into maybe providing more uncovered parking spaces for larger houses, so then there would be other places to park. So I don't know if there's any questions related to that.
Questions from council members?
I understand the rationale, and I believe that if I understand you correctly, the staff would continue to enforce noise ordinance, parking requirements, setback, open yard standards. So that would be our way of addressing the issues that are surrounding boarding houses or in single-family neighborhoods. There's a suggestion to change the boarding house definition. So I didn't see how that would be specifically. Maybe I should have read the actual ordinance language. What's the difference in the new definition? Because it says by form and function, but how does it change?
Mr. Vincent?
Mr. Chair and members of the committee, the current definition of boarding house discusses the number of people who live in the house, as well as other characteristics of the function of the house. Key in it is the provision of board or food in connection with it. This is done in a way of defining what a boarding house is and requiring a conditional use permit for that boarding house. If a property presents those kinds of scenarios, they come back and we say, well, you needed to have a conditional use permit. As staff has explained, the initial approach to this change was to simply delete the definition of boarding house and remove that enforcement posture. After thinking about it a little longer, staff has come back with a suggestion that rather than deleting the definition entirely, we make it more of an affirmative action that the property owner would affirmatively elect to pursue a boarding house. In other words, that the provision of food was integral to the renting of the room, and that if a property owner particularly in a single-family zone wished to operate a boarding house, they would make a presentation and it would have to get a conditional use permit in order to affirmatively approve it. What the change does, what the change from rather than deleting the provision entirely, is it gives a property owner an opportunity to consider that type of use of their property with the safety or the neighborhood preservation or neighborhood protection in place of the conditional use permit. It wouldn't be a matter of right. They would have to come in and get a conditional use permit, but rather than taking out a boarding house entirely, the way staff is proposing it now is that it would basically allow a property owner to pursue that without, and this is the key difference from what we're currently experiencing, is that basically the property owner would have to affirmatively bring in the food and and structure their home as a boarding house, as opposed to the current definition, which allows for confusion between a residence that is simply rented to a group of unrelated people.
Good. So taking out the chance for that kind of confusion by focusing in on the actual function.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And on the form, could I just add, I think one of the things that we see is that if people have a number of individual rooms that have independent access, where they can exclude the access of others in the household. Like there's a balcony on the second floor and it looks like a hotel practically, because there's 3 bedrooms and they have individual doors and they're not connected by a hallway or readily have access to other common areas such as a living room or kitchen. That was the form part of the definition, because we have seen homes designed that way, where each bedroom has an independent access point and the people don't have access to the common living areas except as prearranged as part of room and board.
So that's identified as part of, when you said form and function, that's the form part that stays in the definition.
Right. Well, that actually we add to the
Add it to the
definition.
definition. Okay.
Right now, that's not part of the boarding house definition. That's part of the definition of when we define a separate dwelling unit.
Right.
So we'll take some of the features that are in how you define a separate dwelling unit when we have illegal dwelling unit cases and look in defining the form of a boarding house. But basically, what staff is proposing is boarding houses are not allowed in the single-family zones across the board. They're not permitted with a conditional use permit either. The only zones where you could have a boarding house with a conditional use permit are R2, R3, R4. So
Okay, that's clear.
we would not be looking to allow that type of form or function in a single-family zone because then that would meet the
Good.
definition of boarding house.
Yeah, I'm glad you clarified that, because there, for a moment there it sounded like there was a way to get to that this way, and may almost facilitating that, and I don't think we wanted to go there. Just a quick note for staff, the idea of a property maintenance ordinance, I'd be very interested in knowing more about how that might be shaping up, and we could perhaps meet sometime soon about that to discuss it. I'm kind of interested in that.
All right. First, other council member questions? No.
Okay. Mary Louise Days, representing the Citizens Planning Association Land Use Committee. And I found the two-page discussion on this subject quite confusing because it blended in the boarding house, which is not allowed in single family, and the subject of renting of rooms in single family zones, and the court case, which was a family definition. So I would like to ask staff, are there still provisions in the zoning ordinance to allow for the renting of rooms in single-family houses, like 1 and 2, and a parking requirement?
Mr. Cotto?
Chair Williams, the renting of rooms is allowed in single-family zones. See, here's the thing. A lot of people own houses in town, and they can't really afford them, right? Because who can? So they rent a bunch of rooms out. This happens quite a bit, and so then you get a house that has 4 or 5 unrelated people living in a room. They share the kitchen. They each have their space in the shelf in their refrigerator and what have you. And then, and it could be 4 or 5 or 6 or 8 people in there. And then they each have their own car, and they have parties and, all that stuff. So then the neighbors come in and say, this is a boarding house. The landlord is renting out each to individual people, and it's a boarding house, and boarding houses are not allowed in the single-family zone, so you should be enforcing on these and making them go away, right? I mean, that's where this all comes from. And when we look at it,
Right next door, before you go on, right next door is a family, and it's a woman, and she's married to a man, and they have 3 children, and their aunt lives there as well. So now we have 6 people living in a house next to this group dynamic, and guess what? Those 6 people, the father works at City College and the mother is a nurse, and they rent. They are 6 people renting a home next to 6 other people renting a home. We really got into this at the Planning Commission. I just want to for those of you that were following this at the Planning Commission, and the city attorney weighed in a number of times about being very clear that the renting of individual rooms and the renting of homes in Santa Barbara is a permitted use. There really isn't any difference between those 6 people and someone next door who happens to own their home and have 6 people living there. Because what it goes to is the structure and that it is used as a residence for a period of 30 days or more. Anyway, back to you, Danny.
yeah,
That's
So those are all allowed. Those are all allowed situations.
Yes, I wanted to point that out because I couldn't find the provision in the ordinance. I thought it had been taken out, but during all my years of zoning administration, it was there, and there was a parking requirement. So later on, I'd like to get the section numbers because those do pertain to single family. The discussion of boarding house does not, unless you amend everything, including the conditional use permits. Thank you.
Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair,
House?
she just mentioned, Mary Louise just mentioned that there's a parking requirement, and I don't know what that is. I don't think I've seen anything like that.
The parking requirement is if the structure is a single family or a single unit structure, even that terminology, we've tried to get away from calling it a single family unit, just a single residential unit. The requirement is 2 covered parking spaces, and in some instances you can have 1 covered and 1 uncovered. But the city's parking requirement for this 1 unit dwelling is still just 2 parking spaces. So I think Ms. Days may be thinking back to a different requirement, perhaps for additional parking spaces. When you look at the boarding house section of the parking ordinance, there is additional parking required. I believe it's a parking space for every 2 rooms. So that there is a different parking requirement for boarding homes.
Those parking requirements happen in R2, R3
Right.
zones, where apartment houses, for instance, would have 1 per unit, things like that, right? I mean, that's that kind of, okay.
Mrs. McCammon?
Yes, I'm Kathy McCammon, and I'm here for the League of Women Voters. And I guess now I have more questions when you're talking
That's
about
what I meant by
the
arcane.
Yes, the CUP and the R2, R3, and R4. Are you talking about boarding houses as one large structure in those other zones? Like we traditionally think of a boarding house where there'd be the 1 kitchen, but they are just single-family homes that happen to be bigger in these other zones.
Mr. Cato?
Councilmember Williams, we're really talking about single-family houses. You know, we're not supposed to say family, but, you know, it's a house, right? And how many people can live in a house? If you have a lot of people in there, people say it's a boarding house. And what we're saying as staff is it's not a boarding house, it's the renting of rooms. If you want to have a boarding house, you know, and you want to serve food and all that kind of stuff, then you would come in and get a conditional use permit, and you'd have to have it in one of the multifamily zones. And that's
But Ms. McCammon's question is, regarding CUPs in R2, R3, and R4, what is it that you're talking about? And basically, I can't even really remember in the last 20 years actively working on a boarding house application. I think there are in the files here 2 or 3 perhaps CUPs that sometime since this provision went into the zoning ordinance, and I think it might have been in the 70s or it could have been earlier, where there may be someone that came in for a conditional use permit for a boarding house. We don't have a lot of experience in this regard. They could be 1 large home, or it could be a site that has 2 or 3 buildings operated as a boarding house. We did have someone contact us that looked at a senior residential facility, and they wanted to convert it to what we thought would have been a boarding house. One of the buildings had, this is on Olive Street. You may know it, the transition house went in there for a temporary period. They have 1 building that has a congregate kitchen area, and then there were several multiple outbuildings. We were calling that a boarding house situation. The zoning is R3, so we said what you're looking for is a conditional use permit. It could be someone that just owns a home in the R4 zone and wants to run it as a boarding house. But this happens so infrequently that we aren't really spending a lot of time on the CUP issue. The main reason for discussing this is the concern of people that live in the single-family neighborhoods. It's a legitimate question because it's still on the board. We're not proposing to delete this from the zoning ordinance. The CUP provision is there now. We're proposing to amend the definition of boarding house such that if anyone ever did come in and request a CUP, we would have a better definition. But beyond that, we're not trying to spend time on areas that aren't causing concern.
Okay.
The focus of this was the area of concern, which is the single-family zone. And again, the comment made by Ms. Days, we don't want to have any confusion in the community as to whether or not they're allowed in single families. So they are not allowed now, and it isn't proposed that they be allowed. We continue to believe that it's an inappropriate use for a single-family zone. The problem is the allowed uses in single-family zones, one group living next to another can cause each other a lot of heartache. And that's difficult to regulate. So that's why we brought this to you.
What I'm wrestling with, Mr. Cotto, is, and your viewpoint would be important to me because you're one of the folks primarily charged with enforcement cases. Is it sounds like to me that what part of the substance of this is that we're giving up on dealing with overcrowding because we can't enforce it, and that's what it sounds like to me. And so my question is, isn't that a useful thing, even if it's difficult to enforce? Isn't that a useful thing to sometimes be able to enforce, particularly when there's other things happening at the site, like, known but unproven drug sales or other things? Isn't that a useful thing for zoning enforcement to have in its toolkit?
Chair Williams, I don't think so, because we can address a lot of the symptoms, not all of the symptoms, but a lot of the symptoms through other enforcement mechanisms. If we think there's drugs going on, we can call in the police department. And a lot of things we have a fairly good handle on, but and actually, there is a small hook about an overcrowding in the Uniform Housing Code, which actually, we don't even have that anymore because we adopted the new codes. There used to be a hook that said if you had more than a certain number of people in a room, that was a housing code violation, and we could enforce on that, even though it was a small hook. But really, through consultation with Mr. Vincent, we've really come to the conclusion that we are a very difficult spot when it comes to how many people can live in a house, related, unrelated. We just don't have that ability. And I'll ask Scott a little bit more.
Mr. Vincent?
Mr. Chair.
Can you elaborate on that? Because I think people out there in the public want us to enforce on that, but I've realized it's very difficult to do so, and maybe you could explain why we can't effectively do it.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, the key focus of the proposed change is the fact that the current definition of boarding house, which is basically limited as sleeping quarters for 5 or more guests for a definite prearranged period of 7 days or more, that you have 5 people living in a house that are renting that house 30 days on a month-to-month lease, on a term lease. They satisfy that definition of a boarding house under the current definition. What's happening is this definition is casting too wide of a net and is capturing persons and groups of people and even families, related families where everybody's related, in a definition that isn't intended to capture that kind of scenario. Their living circumstances that's a family living in a home. And the court case that the city was involved with was with a prior definition of this ordinance that made a distinction and said, okay, it's only 5, it has to be 5 unrelated people. And the Supreme Court said, for the city to get into related versus unrelated required an impermissible intrusion into the privacy of the living arrangements. So we took away the unrelated. And now we have just 5 persons, and we're finding that the problem again is, what's the difference between 5 related people who live like a family and 5 related people who live like a family?
Mr. House?
Ms. Weiss, is there a way that we can include an affirmative statement about the single-family zones? We're identifying the zones where this is permitted, the R2, R3, R4, by conditional use permit, and it's not permitted in the single-family zone zones. Can we just say that in there too? I mean, I think we're getting there, but can it actually say that as part of the language in the ordinance? Boarding houses are not permitted within whatever zones they're not permitted in.
Mr. Wiley, I'm going to let you.
I wasn't going to speak to that.
Oh, okay.
It makes sense to me.
I'm going to let you all answer, and I'm going to let people ask another question. But I just want to remind folks that we are an hour through the hearing. We still have parking and fences and hedges left to go, which sounds like it's going to take even more meat than our previous two items. So people will need to be use brevity.
Mr. Chair, as long as this subject came up of enforcing the enforcement concerns related to people renting out rooms in single-family zones, it's complex, and I wanted to mention a couple of things. You know, we just have not given you the answers of what we do and have done for years to enforce, because I don't think it was the main point of this particular section discussion. It was about boarding houses. And not taking the Lompoc approach as being very impractical and getting hopes up, and it's not going to work, in our opinion. But, for example, Scott mentioned the Adamson decision from 1978, yeah. It's a Santa Barbara decision where our ordinance used to say you had to be related to live in a home, single-family home. And then we defined what related meant, and the California Supreme Court said, no, that's unconstitutional. Why can't families decide what a family is? And if you feel related, you can be related. And what's the land use concern? What's the community concern as between two individuals, maybe they're siblings and two individuals or not? How's that a valid distinction? So can't do that anymore. Then Mr. Cotto mentioned the Uniform Housing Code. There's no hook there. The city of Santa Ana tried that in a case called Briseño versus the city of Santa Ana. And said, we are going to take the Uniform Housing Code and occupancy requirements and cut them in half and make Santa Ana half as dense as the Uniform Housing Code allows. And the California Supreme Court said that's unconstitutional. That Uniform Housing Code density standards are set by the state, and there's nothing different about Santa Ana versus Anaheim versus Santa Barbara, and so you can't have your own local density standards. And those Uniform Housing Code density standards are so liberal, if you will, that you can have something like 2 or 3 adults per small bedroom under those standards. They're not any help to us to enforce the density standards. But it is, I want to be brief. We do a lot on enforcement. For example, I used to get a call from a homeowner in San Roque neighborhood, very upset. And it was about his neighbor was renting all the rooms to UCSB students. It's like, I'm sorry, it's legal. It's been determined to be an aspect of property ownership that you can rent rooms out. In fact, you don't have to be an owner-occupant. You can just rent all your 3 or 4 bedrooms to UCSB students, and we can't make that illegal. And this owner would call me, and this guy almost ran me off the sidewalk with his skateboard. Well, I'm sorry, but we can't do anything about that. Call the police, maybe. Or they were too loud last night. Call the police and complain about noise. But they're parking on the street and they're parking in front of my home. Is it legal parking? Yeah, I'm sorry. If we start to regulate that sort of thing, I don't see where it'll ever end if we try to tell people where they can and can't park on residential streets. Those are some of the things. But finally, Betty mentioned at one point that we have a strict definition of a dwelling unit. And what we try to do is force people through the front door, try to force people to use the front door to have access to the common areas. And when we see building permits come in for additions and things, and we see separate entrances, and we see lack of access to the common areas, and we see steps up to a second story right from the outside, second story right from the outside, no, I'm sorry. And we see wet bars, we say, no, I'm sorry. That looks too much like a separate dwelling unit to us. We are not permitting it. Now that's very much a subjective thing, but that's the sort of thing. And in some cases, I just wanted a wet bar, And it's like, all right, we trust you, but when you combine a wet bar with a new side entrance and a new stairway to that entrance, I think that looks a little fishy. We're pretty strict about that, and we push the limits of kind of a subjective determination. Say no, we think that can be abused, and finally, we do really respond to illegal dwelling unit complaints, and we come down on the property owner and say they all better be using the front door. Your garage better be open to parking. Your driveway better be open to parking, and that's about all we can do. And we try to do it as strictly as possible.
I'd like to ask Steve a question. Steve, before you disappear, I'm going to ask my question that I wrote to you. For instance, can the council and can the city attorney, is it legal, if you know that somebody is renting out, say, and the number is optional, four rooms for an example, can you increase the parking requirements on the site? I'd give it to you, Steve. Steve's my neighbor. He puts up with me.
And I did tell Judy that theoretically would be legal, but this is the Lompoc, I think Santa Maria may have looked at it as well, thing, where somebody's renting 4 rooms out. Well, how do you know that? How will you know that? You ask them and they say, no, I'm not renting 4 rooms out. I'm renting 3 rooms out, and then that third guy is actually sharing. It is so hard to enforce that sort of thing. But yes, in theory, that's what Lompoc is trying to do. If they say, and I actually, Judy tweaked it a bit. I think Lompoc may be saying that's illegal, but Judy said, no, well, you could do it, but you just have to provide additional code-compliant parking. It's an interesting aspect. I will caution you that a large part of this is not to get people's hopes up with some magic bullet ordinance, because we will have a difficult time knowing if somebody, and we have a neighbor who rents a lot of rooms out. From any, it's right across the street from me. It's like from any one month to the next. No, these are international students, okay, and they're there 1 or 2 months and they're gone. You never see them again. And some of them are there 6 months and then they're gone. It changes so drastically. I don't know what the answer is, and it varies from month to month. So.
I'd just like to add a comment regarding the parking, because that was a consideration that staff has looked at too. When the single-family design guidelines or NPO update was going through the process, that was one of the questions posed, at least in at least one discussion that I recall, was that if homes are larger homes, say 5 bedrooms or more, should we look at creating additional parking requirements? As I mentioned, the parking requirement for a single unit is 2 covered parking spaces in most instances. The single family, the NPO update committee and ultimately the council adopted a provision that if your house is smaller, less than 85%, you can have 1 covered space and perhaps 1 uncovered. So we've been trying actually to lessen the requirement for how much space and mass the car takes up on people's properties. So it's interesting because in some instances we're trying to reduce the dedication to the automobile, yet in other instances such as this, whether or not the committee wanted to consider, say for homes of 5 or more bedrooms, to have an additional parking requirement. A number of communities in California do have that as a requirement. So we only put that out there that if this continues to be a major nuisance problem related to parking, that's something we could look at in the future, but we're not recommending it at this time. Thanks.
Okay. I'm going to just do a straw poll real quick here, just because it seems to me we have 3 major subsections left and that we're not going to get through all of them by a quarter till. So let me ask, and you can vote more than once. Raise your hand if you are here for fences, walls, screens. Okay, got 3 of you.
4.
Parking, 4. Parking requirements, 3. And distance between buildings. Nobody. 2. So we're going to, if staff, Ms. Reardon, can you start with fences, walls, screens?
Sure. That's not one I actually had prepared any slides for. Because
it's okay. We don't live and die by PowerPoint around here, so please.
Oh,
just...
really?
I'm old school. It's hip to be old school.
Oh, yeah, I'm used to the transparencies where you had the overhead and the
Me too.
drawing the pictures. But what we're proposing, the issue of nonconforming hedges is is a huge issue, and we're actually not proposing to do major changes to that section. What we are proposing is to clarify how much of a nonconforming hedge, fence, or similar structure can be replaced in any calendar year, and what is considered repair and maintenance. So what we're proposing to do is to specify that only 10% of any nonconforming hedge, fence, screen can be replaced in any calendar year, and then also give some direction on how we would determine a hedge to be actually nonconforming. And right now, we generally ask for arborist reports that give their opinion on when the hedge was planted, and if it was before 1957, then it's considered nonconforming. We're also proposing to put a provision in the ordinance that specifies even if your hedge is nonconforming, if the transportation section determines that it is a safety hazard, it poses a safety hazard, then we have the authority to either require it removed or reduced in height so that that hazard is away. And so those are the three main changes we're proposing at this time. And we do, in the future, want to look at the whole issue of hedges in the required setback and what height they should be limited to. Should they even be allowed to be planted there? But that's a whole other issue.
We have questions from ordinance committee members. Councilmember House.
I want to see if I can really get to the intent of this and understand it better. It's my understanding that in many neighborhoods, the hedges kind of give it its character. Their fences may as well. And the big issue had been visibility as you leave or come into a driveway. And we have a requirement there of no higher than 3.5 feet for 10 feet back, and those kinds of requirements for visibility purposes. But as far as hedges and fences in the front yard, I think that's the main area. Our concern now is that, if I understand it correctly, that instead of just repairing or upkeep and maintaining a non-conforming fence, they might take out the old wrecked fence and replace it with a new one that's still non-conforming. Now, first of all, is that the intent of this change, is to address that?
Sure, Councilmember House, yes, that is the intent. What happens, okay.
I'm looking for the problem here, and I haven't found it yet, because it almost sounds like that's not a bad thing. If it was there all along and now we've got a better one, what's the big deal? So what am I missing?
Here's the problem. A lot of fences that we have, a lot of fences are unpermitted, right? So there could be a fence that somebody put in the 60s that's 5 feet tall and right on the front property line that's higher than 3.5 feet. That's allowed. I mean, that higher than the 3.5 feet, which would be allowed, right? It's a 5 foot high
near
fence.
The driveway. You can have a higher fence, but
within 10 feet of the front lot line, you're not allowed to have anything over 3.5 feet tall. Yeah. So you have this 5 foot fence, and it's falling down, right? It's non-conforming as to height, and the city of Santa Barbara is very liberal as far as non-conforming buildings and being able to reconstruct them, but not when it comes to height. So if you have a non-conforming a fence that's non-conforming as to height, you cannot replace it. You can only repair and maintain it. You can't replace it you can't just demo it and rebuild a new one. If you demo it and rebuild a new one, you have to build it at 3.5 feet. So but you are allowed to repair and maintain, right? So what people say to us is, our enforcement officers driving down the street, they say there's brand new 5 foot high fence in the front, and we say, hey, that's a violation, and we are allowed to be a little bit proactive on these things. So we start an enforcement case, and they say, no, it was here. I repaired it by totally taking it down and putting up a new fence. It's repaired. And so what we're trying to say is, no, that's not a repair. Repair is 10% per year, whether it's boards or stringers or fence posts. 10% a year is what we will define as a repair. Anything else is a replacement, and if you replace it, you have to bring it down to the 3.5 foot height limit. Now, safety is an issue. I've been around for a while. The way it was explained to me is there are two aspects to the front yard fence. One is the safety, and one is the separation between the public way and the private way. At least the way it was explained to me, previous councils did not want to have a big separation, so you're walking down the street and all you see is fences, 8-foot-high fences or whatever. So all you see is a public right-of-way, and you don't see, there's no connection between the public and the private. So the 3.5-foot requirement is to maintain sort of a connection from the public and the private. So when people put up these high fences, it seems to me that it goes against that. It's providing more separation instead of less, and so we're trying to get away from that. Now this is like Mr. Irvin said, this is a sort of a short-term thing, and we do want to come back at at a future time and open up the full discussion of what do we want to do with front hedges and side hedges and rear hedges? What do we want to do with this whole thing? In the meantime, hedges are particular difficult one for us because they grow, right? You cut them down to 3.5 feet, and then 6 months later they're at 4.5 feet, and so it's a constant problem. That's where we're coming from with this.
And while we take public questions and comments, since we haven't seemed to be able to hold to that, can we think about, because my concern also is it seems so confusing as to what exactly a screen is, right? And can we, as part of this larger discussion, can we give the public a roundabout month that we will be revisiting this as to, at least the definitions of what a screen is? Because I think that's a hard one. And you don't have to answer it right now. I'll give you time to think about it.
No, I have an answer.
Ooh, that means no.
Yeah. I really don't know when we'll have time to get round to this. We're still on round 1 of the zoning ordinance amendment package. And round 1 was supposed to be the straightforward, fixed problems that we deal with day in, day out that are either clear enforcement problems, interpretation battles with architects, and modifications that really should become standards. The kind of sticky issue pile was round 2, and fences, wall screens, and hedges is clearly a sticky issue, round 2 zoning ordinance amendment package. Our commitment is to do round 1, and then after that, I don't really have the staff resources to undertake round 2 in any substantial way. This is a
forever, or?
Well, I'll keep you advised, but I don't have it assigned to anyone except Danny, who keeps a list of things that he wants to do, and and it's a balancing act. It's pending. It's kind of deep pending. It's not front burner pending. So when we come to the Planning Commission City Council next joint meeting in, I think we set it for March 27th, the Planning Commission City Council workload meeting will be focused on workload priorities and requests of the public to initiate new design guidelines for Coast Village Road, say. Where are we with the second round of zoning ordinance amendment packages? We haven't finished the first. So that'll be an opportunity to look at it, but just as a preview, I'm going to have it as unscheduled, pending.
So the recourse of members of the public would be to ask for that at the joint hearing to be a priority.
Yes, and then it would have to be a priority over something else that's happening.
Take Mr. Cotto out for a beer and try to get it on that list.
But it really is, it's on the list. It's a big part of the list. It's on the list. It's probably the top of round 2 list. It's just that this is only meant to deal with the fact that the zoning ordinance now says you can repair and maintain. And we're not changing what is legal heights or any of those things, just trying to address the repair and maintenance.
Mr. Chair, I know there's people that want to speak. I just wanted to say one thing. One of the things I have trouble with this just is the practicality of it. Somebody has a fence that's starting to show wear and needs to be fixed. They go over to Home Depot or someplace and they talk to them. Pretty soon they realize they should probably just replace the whole thing. They go into the expense of buying all the stuff. They put maybe a footing needs to be fixed. So they put up their new fence and they're all proud of this new fence. And they're like, well, it's just the same as the old one, so what's the big deal? Now, zoning enforcement comes down and says, take down this thing you just invest all that money in. There was no proactive component to that. You know, people who are in the public think of themselves as doing a good thing, fixing up their beat-up old fence, and yet now here we are putting them through another round of taking down and rebuilding somewhere else. I would like to know the practical way to implement this in a positive sense, not just catch them when they did something wrong. Is there a way to actually accomplish this where we would head, if we're going to do this, how would we head people off at the pass so they wouldn't make that big expense in the first place? And I don't know that handymen and the general public who fixes their fence are going to be the ones that would know about this. They just wouldn't be dealing with us until they got in trouble. So that's sort of an issue that I would like us to discuss at some point. Others may have things.
You know, my feeling is that Mr. Cotto is involved in the day-to-day of enforcement well enough to tell us what's going to help him enforce and what's not going to help him enforce. And I think we just heard amendments, with the renting, what is unenforceable, and the intent of this is to make it more enforceable, is it not, Mr. Cotto? By precisely defining that repairing more than 10% is not repairing, it's replacing. Mr. Khan?
Yes, I was going to hold my general comments to the end if they become relevant.
It's okay. This is where I think we're only getting through this item.
Yeah, okay. Anyway, I really like our zoning ordinance here. We adopted our first one in 1924, and I put together a book of the old ones. This is the 1930 zoning ordinance, and this is the 1924 general plan that was done by the Olmsteds. And, what my concern is here is I look at almost everything that's presented in this thing as erosion of the zoning laws. We are here because of what our zoning has done. We live in a beautiful place, one of the most desirable places on the earth, but the zoning's helped keep it that way. And I look at anything that's an erosion. And what was directly in point was talking about the city's interpretation of nonconforming uses. Mr. Cotto is right. The city has a very liberal interpretation of it. And I always equate the concept of a nonconforming use, it's like a person, a building, has a certain lifespan. You change the law, property becomes nonconforming. As soon as it becomes nonconforming, you're giving them a dispensation. You're saying, for the life of this building, you can keep it. But what we've seen here is things rebuilt, as he said, and other things maintained in the other definition. I think Betty nodded in agreement with it. And really, it's a little too liberal. It undermines the zoning that we've done. I think also what I see us doing, as you know, every one of you in this room knows that I've spoken against the liberality of granting modifications and exceptions to the zoning. There were 102 resolutions last year. I don't know how giving 300-400 modifications that were given. I look at that as undermining zoning. And I look at that you are essentially, one thing was done with your amendment several years ago. You created an incentive for mixed-use projects. In one ordinance or group of ordinances, I can be corrected on it. And this is what has created the incentive for the Chapala monsters and everybody else. Somebody will slip in a little commercial, call it mixed use, and all the setbacks, residential and upper stories, go away that would be in commercial. And so the mixed use, and I'm saying let's look at the major ones that have undermined our zoning, the mixed use exception that exists. And then what I think we really
wrap up, Mr. Kahan.
I'll wrap it up real quickly. And then what we're doing is with these monsters, we've created canyonization and this monsterization. And one of the things you've referred to, Mr. Williams, is the solar thing. One of the things I've learned the hard way is solar thing is basically in residential. It is not applied. Commercial properties sometimes overshadowing residential. And that should really be expanded. And similarly, the NPO that talks about neighborhood compatibility only applies to single-family residence zones, as I understand. And very honestly, commercial backs up to it, and we're looking at a buffer between it. So I think we should look at the major issues, and in conclusion, I think these are a tremendous amount of things to cover. We have some people in this room that are expert in this, but I think each one of the items here has to be focused on separately. A lot of things to discuss. They're very specialized, and it's almost too much to digest. I apologize for taking too much time, but I couldn't say it any more quickly than I did. Thank you for your consideration.
Hi, my name is Michelle Giddens, and I'd like to know if we're doing our comments or just asking questions. Or
Questions and comments. This is it,
just
but
go for it.
we
Okay.
gotta-
My
well,
first
I'm just going to ask folks to keep it
Keep it quick.
to 2 or 3 minutes.
My first question was about hedges. Is there a situation where you would have a permitted hedge that is now non-conforming, and how would that work into your scenario?
Sure. Well, the way this works is hedges, like I said, they grow. That's a problem for us. But the way we enforce on them right now is if we get a complaint of an overheight hedge, we have a little bit of expertise, and but basically what it comes down to is if you can get 3 arborists to give us a report saying this hedge was in existence in 1957. We don't have to know how tall it was. That's basically impossible. But if this particular hedge, these hedge plants were in existence in 1957, then it's non-conforming at a certain height, whatever height. And if you can't, then it's not. And then you would have to, through enforcement, you'd have to cut it down to whatever the height requirement is.
Okay. Well, again, my name is Michelle Giddens. I'm the past president of the Citywide Homeowners Association. I'm also the founder of the new Marine Terrace Homeowners Association, which is just in its early conception stages. And I want to thank Mr. Cato and Susan Reardon and Betty Weiss for their work and the entire staff on this. I have one suggestion. I'll talk about that at the end, but I just want to say that I think, and I'm probably in the minority here, that these are well-conceived changes. They're consistent with the intent of the zoning ordinance, and that they make good sense. If we're consistently granting a modification for a certain situation, then maybe it shouldn't be a modification. I personally went through that on a corner lot with a situation with my garage, and I do applaud the splitting of the open space requirements. I think it just makes sense. I think it increases homeowners' flexibility, and it will save valuable staff time. These changes also address some of the biggest complaints that I hear from neighbors and applicants and homeowners. And so I applaud your efforts to streamline and improve the difficult and cumbersome planning process. So thank you. I specifically also want to say that having that hot water heater or whatever it is, the softener whatever in the side is great, and the window seats, I like that. All of those elements are good. There's one suggestion that I have, and since I am on a corner lot, it's come up in my mind. Would it be possible to include something like a compost pile, and there might be other items? The other one that I could think of are solar panels, which you put on the ground that heat a pool or something like that. Include that in an open yard. Include that as open space, even if it encroaches in like the corner of a corner lot, if you can understand that. So it's really in the front yard, but it's on that side corner, and it's maybe in an inconspicuous area. Maybe that would be a modification. I don't know, but just something I thought about during the discussion that I wanted to bring up. Thank you very much for your time.
Who would think hedges would be such a hot item? My name's Michael Self, and I'd like to address, as far as the non-conforming aspect, if you go down, especially in the bungalow district, you see some big hedges on front, some not hedges, and that it's my dealings with the cities that when there has been something there for a long period of time, it becomes grandfathered rather than non-conforming. And you can explain this to me later, but this social engineering attitude of you need to have more social interaction with the people walking by your hedge, I find uncomfortable. Many of us socialize a lot during the business day. We're at work. We want to go home to our castle and hide. Because if you look at a lot of the homes, especially those on Las Positas, you see every window and shade drawn. And so these people have lost the capacity to enjoy their own yards. And I would think that a street something like Las Positas, if they were able to have, say, hedges, which are less solid than a wall, that their children would be now playing outside. They'd have their windows open. You know, okay, they're going to miss the 45-mile-an-hour speedway outside their window, but it would be a sound buffer. It accommodates, it makes the air cleaner. So there are lots of things that I'd like you to consider where hedges aren't all bad. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you. My name is Bernie Bernstein,
And I really appreciate all the time and attention that everybody's putting into this, because I know it's a big job. But it seems to me, I'm hearing words today like things like maximize development, and I'm hearing sheds, quote unquote, and I'm finding all these things, battles with architects I'm hearing. And to me, these put up a red flag. And in particular, item number 1 regarding non-conforming open yard, and then the final item regarding the distance between the buildings, I think are incredibly controversial. They're complicated. They have a lot of impacts on the neighborhoods. And after 3 years of developing the NPO, I think that they should have a separate time, and as Mr. Kahan suggested, perhaps be dealt with separately, because I think they have a lot of impacts. And thank you very much for your time.
Mr. Chair, perhaps we could clarify, and Bernie, the first item on the agenda was not discussed here today, and it has been put off as you just requested.
Well, I meant the item that I know about that one. I think that was a good decision, but I'm talking about the first item that we did talk about, which has to do with the modifications and
you're talking about yard encroachment,
non-conforming, because I think when you think about that, what we're really doing is we're taking the whole FAR concept and we're letting the houses grow even more on small lots. So I'm really concerned about that one.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Chair Williams and Ordinance Committee members, I'm Diane Channing, and I'm speaking from experience as former president of the Riviera Association, former chair of the View Ordinance Task Force, chair of the Neighborhood Preservation Ordinance Steering Committee, and one who has worked closely with the fire department on the wildland fire plan. The issue of hedge height and the planting, trimming, and replanting of a row of trees along property lines has long been a concern that is used to circumvent the hedge ordinance. I hope we can address today or in the near future. Large trees at the property lines can create massive walls that affect solar access, air circulation, defensible space for fire safety, and views. The View Ordinance addresses sunlight or solar access as a right of homeowners. However, this is not a good tool for most solar concerns. The city needs to have a policy regarding solar access and vegetation, and it's my hope that guidelines will be created for clarity on bringing together the wildland fire plan, hedge ordinance, and solar accessibility for the future. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Kathy McCammon, and I'm speaking here today for the League of Women Voters. I feel like this is not my day. I went to the wrong place. You decided not to discuss one of the items we wanted to discuss, and you haven't gotten to the third item we wanted to discuss. But I think there are some general concepts that we wanted to say. We think that the main question is one we have put before you before. Why are the zoning ordinance changes being considered now before the general plan update? Why not wait until the GPU to make these changes? You will just have to go over these areas again and again. Then, even though you didn't talk about the non-conforming open yard area, I think that's an example of something we want to address, and that is that we and the public believe that the city has been too lax in the granting of the sheer number of modifications they do. Just because we don't like the number of modifications does not mean we want to see them done away with. It would be moving in the totally wrong direction to allow the requested deviance from the rules to be allowed by right. Then I assume that next time you will talk about the handicapped disabled residential unit. We have a question there. And then lastly, but not least, diagrams really help in understanding some of these proposed ordinance changes, and we were hoping that they would be part of this set, and we would hope that they would be part of the next set. And I will leave copies of our statement for all of you. Thank you.
Mary Louise Days for the Citizens Planning Association. And the preliminary comment, of course, is that we also feel that there have been way too many modifications granted in the past several years. And there should be the opportunity for further discussion of some of these. My statement, but I'll have one copy for the staff here, is in note format responding to this staff report. We also feel in several cases that explanatory diagrams would be helpful. We have a number of comments about the individual items under yard encroachments. We do not agree that with the many proposals for allowing a number of encroachments into required open yard area and interior yards. Some of the handicap items, the unregistered vehicle items, reasonable accommodation items we do agree with. And under the modifications item, we feel it's necessary to see proposed language before comments can be made, and of course that applies to any zoning ordinance amendment. We need to see the full language that's proposed before there can be full discussion. The distance between buildings, which is the last item addressed, we feel there have been too many modifications granted. We do not favor this proposal. The distance between main buildings in most cases is only 15 feet, and if numerous encroachments are allowed, then the purpose is defeated. You're left with almost nothing separating main buildings. I will turn this one copy in, and we will reserve the right to speak later. Thank you.
Just for folks' information, there will not be a later today. It will be the third hearing. What we're not getting to is family daycare, distance between buildings, parking, and reasonable accommodation. So please don't speak to those. Speak to the items that we are covering.
Mr. Chairman, how much time do I have?
3 minutes, Mr. Salzman.
I can't do it. I have to have at least a half an hour to present my evidence.
Well, we have a city council meeting that starts at 2 o'clock. And
okay,
so that's
do you have another meeting
impossible.
of this type later on?
We will, but there will not be a half an hour allocated. I've met with you personally, and other members of the committee can meet with you personally to hear all the background, and I think it is partially your case, which is one of the reasons why this ordinance amendment is going to be needed. Yeah. So you, I think, might see some hope because of these ordinance
well,
amendments.
Well, who can I've talked to you. I haven't got a result from you. You didn't answer
Well, that's
me.
because we don't have the tools to create the result that you want yet at this time. Please, you have 3 minutes, and then we will have
There's nothing I can tell you. I have to produce the evidence I have. This is the 8th year that I'm tackling this problem. Well, and it's one of a line of sight, a public hazard.
Mr. Salzman, once you're done with your comments, I'll have a chance to address once you're done with your comments, I'll have a chance to address the nexus between your case and these suggested changes, among other things.
Fine. I'll hear it. Thank you.
Public comment is now closed. Any comments by council members, concluding comments by council members? Mr. House?
Mr. Chair, I think that on the two main things that we really discussed today, the yard encroachments, and having had a lot of questions answered on the renting of rooms in single-family zones, and getting the clarification that I needed, at least, on the way that definition is handled, I'd like to move that we move those two items forward for City Council consideration, and then we can look at the other things later. But if we can do this one part, it'd be good.
Well, I believe the way this is going to be done is we are going to give staff comments. They are going to prepare the actual language of the ordinance changes, and so
we're going to need to. We're going to have. You'll bring the actual
Yes.
final. Oh, I thought we were going to be making comments that from our conversation today. Then you would be bringing that to council. No, you're coming back to us once again.
Right. We need to prepare the whole ordinance. You may recall or not, this is new information. At the prior meetings, we worked through, again, a number of issues where either straw votes were taken or the consensus was this is a good direction to go. Now we have to draft the language and come back.
Well, then my
and present
comment
the
is I'm
language.
comfortable with what we have here before us on those two items that we've thoroughly discussed today, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. This fences, walls, and screens is a big issue. I think we're just trying, I understand staff's trying to take it down, just that one particular piece of it, and my question stands is how practically can we actually make it a positive instead of just a negative? There may be a way to communicate with the public and have them understand and respond to it, but I'm a little concerned that it's almost a setup, and I don't want that. I want to see us help people conform to the, make improvements that are appropriate, and I'm concerned how we can accomplish that. That's it. I'm looking forward to these others, and I'm sorry people came who wanted to talk about these and couldn't. But this is kind of a roll up your sleeves kind of thing. So I'll have to get back together again and work.
So, Mr. Francisco, are sure you don't have any desired changes or details that to be looked at of these three items?
Chairman Williams, I think that there's still a lot more detail to see here, and having just joined this discussion, I'm content to let it rest.
Okay. My comments are as follows: that I agree with the sentiment that we grant too many modifications in the city. I've long agreed with that. I think the intent, though, in these cases are to make some things, first of all, more enforceable. I think that's particularly the case with the changes to the zoning amendment for hedges and screens. And on boarding houses, and in the case of yard encroachments, more simplistic in their design and more consistent in their design. It seems to me, in looking at all of these, that all of the uses that are on the ground are 3 feet encroachment in the open yard, and all of them that are in the air are 2 feet encroachment in the open yard. And to me, having some simplicity is desirous. I think that while, in looking at some of the other ones, I may change my mind about some of the other changes, but I think that these are appropriate. In particularly, to me, the changes in screens is exactly what we've needed to create more consistency with the zoning ordinance. To me, this is a strengthening of the zoning ordinance because it's precisely defining that new means more than 10% change in 1 year, and providing staff with the tools to enforce that and to require more consistency with the zoning ordinance. I do disagree with the sentiment that changes and allowances of mixed use have led to big buildings. We have big buildings that are commercial that we aren't even able to review. So at least the mixed use buildings we can review and say no to if someone appeals them. That would be my answer to that point. And the only changes I would require is to strip out water softeners in the allowable uses. I think that's inconsistent with our water department's policy to promote use of water softeners that substantially degrade the water quality and necessary for treatment in our wastewater system. And then the point that was made about ground solar. Would ground solar be 3 feet, or would that be 2 feet? If it's under 10 inches from the ground.
Chair Williams, ground solar right now counts as an obstruction, is not allowed in open yard or the setbacks.
And what's the logic behind that?
Unless it's 10 inches or less, but usually they're up at an angle.
That's what I'm asking. If it's, I don't see the case in which it would be.
Right, if it was 10 inches or less currently, without doing anything at all, we would allow that to encroach. But usually they're up at an angle and it's more than 10 inches.
Okay. I thought that was a good question and something that deserved an answer. And I guess I'll make a deal with you, Councilmember House. If I have to wait to figure out how to define the hedges, can you wait? Because I think that this is something separate from that. This is an attempt to allow our zoning enforcement staff to properly enforce the existing zoning laws. So Mr. House and I will eagerly await the time when that rises to the top of Mr. Cotto's list. Mr. Francisco?
Mr. Chairman, one comment regarding the water softener units. If they're legal, which I understand that they are, then I think that the ordinances need to make provision for them. As long as people can put them in, then it's something that should be in the language.
Maybe you could clarify that something we can make it legal, just whether it's an allowable use into the encroached setback. There's a difference there, right?
If I can address both that issue and the hedge issue for just a minute. I think what we're talking about is a small accessory structure storing utility materials, whether it's a hot water heater or a water softener or garden tools. We tend to go by the structure itself as whether or not that's an allowed 4 walls and a roof in a certain location. And the more specific we can be, the types of things the structure can be used for, the more easily we can apply it. But I wouldn't have a problem not listing, that's a double negative. I think it's okay not to list water softening because that makes it look like, you know, we're anticipating or encouraging those. But if someone proposed a shed and they put the water softener in there, we would not prevent it. So I think there's some middle ground there that will still allow people's personal choice, but without appearing to promote the use of the water softener. On the hedge issue, if the committee would at least, what our recommendation would be, agree to move this forward. Ultimately, how the members of council vote, there will need to be 5 affirmative votes on every element of any zoning change. We'd be interested in at least knowing if you all, as a committee, want to at least move it forward. We would certainly like to move this forward. If the committee didn't, we might still have a staff opinion in the ultimate council package, just because it really is important to us to deal with at least this little bit of the hedge issue. So we'd love to have your review of the language of the ordinance when it comes, and maybe you could hold off on your vote as to whether or not you support it at that time. But I'd hate to see it drop out entirely now on your behalf, if you'd consider at least moving it forward a bit.
Mr. House?
Yeah, I do understand why there's certain circumstances where we would want to have this kind of a hook. On the other hand, I wish there were some way. I just can see some place where the termites have got to the thing and it's just ugly and awful, and somebody takes the trouble to fix it, and then we're going to ding them for doing that. And something about that bothers me, and I haven't quite got it down. So I want to see the language, and also I would like to hear how maybe the general interest I have is how we communicate this kind of stuff in a proactive way, generally speaking, not just about this one thing.
Well, that's something I'd like to follow up with, say, the Allied Homeowners Association. That might be something they can help us with, help get the word out throughout the city to different neighborhoods about what are the city's guidelines for how to maintain their property, in particular fences, old fences. Thanks.
Is there a motion? Hearing none.
I mean, well, I think they've gotten the direction, and we're okay for the next time, I think.
All right.
For these things we've discussed.
And Mr. Francisco is the leaving water softeners out of the language, but not specifically prohibiting them. Is that satisfactory to you?
I think if it makes people feel better, it's okay with me.
Great. Our wastewater staff is going to feel so much better that we are making their job more difficult. Thank you. I want to particularly thank the public for rallying and moving through public comment very quickly. And we'll adjourn the meeting of the Ordinance Committee for January 15th, 2008. Thank you.